Let's embark on the Ark Republic to hear current news that's published. More than gossip and chatter, covering current affairs that matter. We talk issues with professional views, all keeping you in queue. We wanted a higher vibe for these days and times, to free the voices and minds, reporting the sign of the times, so all can build. Let's shine, yeah.
Greetings wherever you are situated in this universe. My name is Dr. Kaya Nyambi Shivers, and welcome to Ark Republic News. It is so good to be back and reporting on news that matters to us at Ark Republic. And again, we are speaking to Dr. Sherice Nelson. How are you doing, Dr. Nelson?
I can't complain, girl. I cannot complain. It's a lot heating up on this international stage.
Yes, it is. And because Dr. Nelson is an international relations expert, and she is the one who actually walked us through the Ukraine-Russia conflict and other things about the world. We talk about Africa, a lot of issues that go on. It is so imperative that we understand what's going on right now. So thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and I want to say this before we start. When I'm in spaces and people ask me about Ark Republic, they often think that Ark Republic, how do I want to say it? They think Ark Republic's audience is just Black people, which if it was just Black people, I don't mind because I love my folk, right? But they often try to box Ark Republic into its identity and what it is. And I have to always correct folk and say, I'm a Black woman. This is a Black-owned business. It is Black operated. So if you know anything about news, you actually see the world through your lens. However, we report and look at issues from a global perspective. So this is why it's so critical for us to be talking about what's going on at the world and help folk break down exactly where we are, what we need to do, what's going on, because a lot of people really don't know what is going on. So thank you for joining us. So let's jump right into it. What's going on, Dr. Nelson?
So this is what I tell people all the time when I was at Southern University and teaching students about American foreign policy, a class that I taught. It was all about your lens, right? That what you said in the opener is that understanding what's happening on the global stage right now is understanding your lens. Understanding what lens you're actually looking through. And I think oftentimes what happens in the Black community is that we as a people love to be in a collective, right? We love to lend our voices in a collective way to speak against oppression, because wherever we are situated as being Black, whether we are in Europe, if we are in the United States, or if we're in the Caribbean, if we're on the continent of Africa, that there has been some oppression that we have intimately felt. And so we often feel inclined to put our voices in collectivity against oppression. And so what I really love to do is to get everybody to understand that how we see everything is through this lens. And that lens in many ways is established by the understanding of international organizations, right? Is that after World War II, we get what's called the United Nations, which is a stronger league of nations, which really is kind of like the governing and the government for the entire world, right? And so what we have to do is, when we're starting to see things like crack and break down across the global landscape, the best way to start looking at things, I think, from our lens as Black people, is we understand what racism means, right? We understand that racism means that white Anglo-Saxons, for the most part, want to have the ability to control not just a country or a set of countries, but the world. And that then there are maneuvers and movements that are used to then best do that, either directly or indirectly. And those actions happen and often start at the United Nations. So I think that's the first thing, is getting people to understand is that oftentimes we that are smart want to get people excited about all the pieces, right? Well, this piece happened and this piece happened. No. Let's deal with the overarching understanding that the international global landscape is governed in many ways through perception, number one, and that perception is shaped by what these countries do on the international stage through these international organizations.
Thank you for that. I wanted to start with maybe kind of a breakdown. There's other conflicts that are going on in the world. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in the world. what makes the Israel and Hamas, maybe slash Palestine one, so critical right now?
Okay. And one of the biggest reasons it's extremely critical right now that people, I think, are missing is the loss of the Wagner Group, or the Wagner Group, that was essentially dismantled once their CEO died in Russia. Now, died under some conspicuous circumstances, but died nonetheless, right? And died after he tried to, some say run a coup, some say not, right? But after the CEO's and I can't pronounce his name correctly, which is why I don't say it. But the if you look up the Wagner Group, right, you'll know that this CEO started off as Putin's chef, right, and then started off as Putin's chef, and then blossomed into this organization or company that that became like a mercenary group that then waged war throughout the world, through arms dealing, through boots on the ground, etc. And that's called the Wagner Group. So the Wagner Groups created a vacuum in many ways that has now precipitated this Israeli spotlight, this Israeli-Palestinian Middle East spotlight again. That's a web. That's a web. But I think the center block of that is the loss of the Wagner Group, and then the response from the international community because of that.
So yeah, so I pulled up his name. It's Yevgeny Prigozhin, something like that, right? So he's dying sometime in August.
He died in August.
So this is very recently. All right.
Okay. So he died in August, right? Okay. So and so the Wagner Group was supplying arms, supplying support. So let me back up. Because we are now now the world is governed by an agreed upon a set of rules. There is something called the war doctrine, right? There is crimes against humanity, right? There are rules for how you engage in war, and those rules apply to sovereign states, meaning they apply to militaries. They don't apply to groups like the Wagner Group, right? Because they are then what is known as a private paramilitary force, or they're a private military force, and so they're not necessarily governed to the same world rules as if the United States Army, or the Israeli Army, or the Qatar Army, or the Saudi Arabian Army, right? Every country has its own army, but your army in many ways has to then subscribe to the rules of war that's been established inside of a UN resolution, inside of a charter. So I want to start there and say that the Wagner Group, or groups like this, are necessary, because if I want something done that can't, quote unquote, be legally done inside of the framework of how the world says that war should happen, then I bring in a group like this. And we have seen this group all over the continent of Africa, right? They've been all over the continent of Africa. They've been in the Ukraine, and they have supplied from an ammunition perspective, people in the Middle East. Okay. So this group, and they've been in South America, right? They've also provided arms and provided support in Venezuela, right? So I want to get you guys to understand that this group, in many ways, was, before the death of their CEO, was operating all throughout the world, and at any point in time could be dropping off weapons to then create powder kegs in places for some level of gain. And what I want to say is that Hamas attacking Israel after the death of the CEO of Wagner Group is not by accident. Hamas attacking the Israel's during a holiday was not by accident. Doesn't happen by accident. While Bibi Netanyahu is trying to eradicate the judicial system inside of the country that would make it so that he doesn't have to ask them to go to war. Hamas did not attack Israel. It was timed at a particular point while the Ukraine is literally coming to the United States and asking us for more money to fight their war, right? None of these things are by accident. Timing of these things speak then to the erosion of democracy, the erosion of the sovereign state to be able to control groups on the international stage.
That's a lot to unpack. Okay, so what you're saying is that the Wagner Group's dismantling, right? That Netanyahu is pivoting, knowing that there's some type of weakness, right, to do so. And so Hamas responding in a way, is it aiding Netanyahu or is it attempting to break Netanyahu down?
It's aiding Netanyahu. It's a swing that aids Netanyahu. And what I mean by that is that Netanyahu was inside of his country, along with other Zionists, trying to break down the judicial system. The suspending of, and it's very complex, but to make it as simple as possible, he was trying to get rid of the Supreme Court. And by getting rid of the Supreme Court in Israel, it then removes a barrier when it's time to declare war. And because Bibi Netanyahu's fate and politically inside of the legislature was tenuous, it was tight, meaning it was tight, just like we see in the United States, right? The Republicans may have an advantage, but it's a very slight, it's a slight advantage. It's not, it's 20 votes, right? It's a slight advantage. The same type of phenomenon is happening in Israel for Bibi Netanyahu in his legislature. And so the judicial, which is supposed to be seen far more impartial, is the stopgap for them going to war in their country in a way that it's not a stopgap for us going to war here in the United States. And Bibi Netanyahu, before Hamas attacked, was trying to dismantle that, to then be able to get to war faster.
Interesting. So how does this, let's bring this back to the United Nations, right? So we were talking about the United Nations. How does this fold in?
Yes, this folds in because the United Nations is responsible for ensuring that then, I don't want to get into Article 5, but it's ensuring that war happens justly, and that when war doesn't happen justly and there's a humanitarian crisis, that the United Nations steps in. One of the ways it steps in is through their Security Council. Okay, their Security Council is made up of 5 permanent members. Those permanent members are Russia, the United States, China, France, Britain, and ourselves, right? So those are the permanent members inside of their permanent members. I think they expanded to 6 now, but those are the permanent members. France, the United States, China, Russia, that's all of us, right? China,
UK,
always is wrong. China, Russia, France, the United States, and the UK. Those are your 5 permanent members. Those are 5 permanent members. They have to vote unanimously on any resolution. Now, they've expanded the Security Council, so you have 5 permanent members, and then you have countries that are rotating members that also get to sit on that. Why does that make any sense, or why does that matter? Because in 2022, Joe Biden announced to the UN that the African Union deserves a permanent seat on that Security Council.
Okay, now.
Okay.
He did something.
That permanent seat on the Security Council ensures that the continent of Africa always has a say about if the UN is going to bring troops, if they're going to bring humanitarian aid, whatever they're going to do from a security standpoint, even on the continent of Africa, is going to have to be cleared by some Africans. That started ruffling feathers.
I think, but because AFRICOM, right? Because the United States has a stronghold in Africa. Okay.
Right. And what Joe Biden's argument is that AFRICOM was used to help African countries. AFRICOM was supposed to be a strategic initiative by the United States that happened during the Obama administration, to then show that African nations can be trusted from an international space to be good brokers. They have now done that with AFRICOM, and now they deserve a permanent seat at the table when we're making decisions. That pissed a lot of people off, that ruffled feathers, because that changes the dynamic on the international stage. So people that do not then want this level of change start pulling at levers that start pulling at levers across the world that they're able to do based upon the idea that you have groups like the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group is just the ones that we know the most, that's been the most powerful, who has gained steam right under Russia. But there's other groups out there that are like that. Now you start pulling on these groups and start pulling on these conflicts in the dark. You start pulling on the Palestinian, you start pulling on Hamas's problem with Israel. You start pulling on Saudi Arabia's issue with Iran and Yemen. You start pulling on a crisis in Mali, right? That where they're having border issues in Mali. You start pulling on a crisis there. You start pulling on a crisis in Venezuela, right? So it's this idea that once the international stage and the power of Black people in many ways solidifies at the top, then there's all these skirmishes around the world that then get you to second guess, right, giving that type of power.
Interesting. Oh, this is the tangled web that somebody weaves, right? So we're going to get more into the weeds of that. But the question that some people might be asking as they're learning about this very complex nuance, here we go, right? Web of relationships and breakdowns is that how do I, as a Black person in America, what does that mean to me and why should I care?
So this is why you should care, because most of us are holding on to cell phones or devices. 70% of all bauxite needed for that phone is found on the continent of Africa. The reason that you should care is because the rubber on your tires is coming in raw material form from the continent of Africa. I mean, the list can go basically on and on and on. All of the minerals and the things that we're finding, not diamonds, not rubies, not things that we think are luxury items, things that are playing a direct role in our ability to have the lifestyles that we have. Those minerals are being harvested primarily off the continent of Africa. And if instability is the functionality of the day on the continent, to ensure that certain Western powers or Eastern powers or Russian or middle European powers get to have a say and a control in where those minerals go, it then directly affects us as Black people about being able to get those products, about being able to create business structures around them, to be able to thrive in our own countries on top of disease. That's outside of disease, which we understand that was immediately affected with us, that immediately affected us with COVID, right? That's outside of disease. We're not even talking disease. I'm just talking about raw materials that we need to live our everyday lives are coming from that continent. And if they destabilize those areas, or if destabilization is then the order of the day, then the way of life that we understand is gone.
So basically, there will be serious economic instability if this happens. Like
diabolical.
And those who are at the bottom, you think you're at the bottom now, you're going to be 30 feet under, right?
You're going to be 30 feet under.
Because it will be those who can only access, what we would consider everyday items now become high stakes items. So this is why there is this little undercurrent. I don't know if you've seen this, of people saying, what about the 1 million displaced in the DRC, right? The Democratic Republic of Congo, right? So this is what this is connected to?
Yes, but it's connected on a larger stage of this. It's all connected and tied back to democracy. And this is something that I think that for all of the democracy is bad, because oftentimes democracy saddles itself with capitalism, right? For all of democracy's bad, here's the good. The good is that democracy is the idea that even one person has a voice and a way to participate. And the African people have grafted onto that fiercely, right? Whereas here in the United States, turnout for elections is down, right? It is something that in the Black community you see we're fighting against. That is not the case on the continent of Africa. They are walking miles. They are actively engaged in the democratic process, so much so that the world right now, from a global perspective, all over the world is watching two elections on the continent of Africa, one in Ghana and one in South Africa, because elections in those two places will drastically change trade routes, can drastically change trade routes. And so the best thing to do if you are concerned about world domination is to make those areas or those areas around them as unstable as possible. And instability is tied in many ways to the Middle East, because we call it the Middle East because it's in the middle of the map. Now, I hate the idea of calling it the Middle East because it centers Westernism, right? Because it centers the West. So it's really Western Asia. But if we think about it, conflicts in the Middle East have a way of spreading all throughout the world. There is no way that you escape from a issue in the Middle East. There's no way to escape from it because the rest of the world is all connected to that spot. So we already know we have a known powder keg. We have a known powder keg in Israel and Palestine in the area. And that powder keg is less about ethnic understandings and undertones and all about the engines of capitalism, about who gets money, when, and where. Okay. And so that is, so it is, if I'm seeing the idea, and I know this is hard for people to say, how is one connected to the other? No one argues that the foot is connected to the body until it's time to walk. Right? What I'm saying is that African Americans, Black people throughout the continent, their ability to grow in power is upsetting the entire global landscape. And we will then see proxy wars as a result of that. And the way that you tamp down or then expand proxy wars is through groups like the Wagner Group, who can pull a lever. And now that the CEO has decided that he was bigger than the person that allowed him to get in that position, he has now been deposed of, and it's now left in many ways the group that then tamps down and expands in a state of chaos.
Yes. Allegedly been deposed. Allegedly. So why? So the question, and I've been seeing this now, is the United Nations, why can it not get a hold of this situation? What's the problem?
Yes. So this is a problem I love to have a conversation about, right? And the reason they're not effective is because, in my opinion, we wanted too much democratic consultation. Okay. The Security Council, 5 permanent members, not the rotating members, but the 5 permanent members have to agree unanimously on any decision that's made. Now, we've named those 5: the United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK. In the last vote that we just saw, as far as essentially asking for a ceasefire in the region, you had the United States voting against, you had the UK abstaining, you had China voting for, Russia voting for, and I think, and then France voting against. I think France hopped on our side, and then the UK. Yeah, I think the France hopped on our side, and the UK abstained from voting. So even in a place where everybody's connected, you cannot get to a resolution about what to do. And so in many ways, the idea that a permanent council then makes this decision, or these 5 permanent members make these decisions, I think there needs to be a rethinking about that. That then allows all of the members, in many ways, it allows all of the members to make this decision versus just the permanent 5. Now, the pushback against that is the permanent 5 put up the most money as far as allowing the UN to function, which was why during the Trump years, people in the United States were very nervous from a global perspective when he said he was going to stop funding NATO and stop sending his dues to the UN, because it would then remove our ability to then have a lopsided amount of influence inside of that Security Council and the UN as together. So one of the biggest reasons that these 5 members are permanent is not just because they're the world powers and we decided. No, it's also because they put up the most amount of money.
Thank you. So what do you think is going to happen to the United Nations if it does not help this situation?
I think that this skirmish in many ways calls for there to be serious, there needs to be serious conversations about permanent member use. It may not result in the African Union. Let me first tell people what the African Union is. The African Union is in many ways just like the European Union, right? The argument is that there is no permanent African nation there is no African nation that's a permanent member on the Security Council, yet oftentimes the places that aid has to be sent or military flannexes have to be sent are on the continent. So that's the argument. So the way to remedy that is to give it to the AU, which is a conglomerate of all 54 nations. So that's the next thing. The African Union, unlike the European Union, has a representative from every single one of their countries. And so the argument is that the AU should get the permanent seat because it doesn't then advantage one African nation over the other. So what I think is what this does is that the more this crisis rages, this crisis between, in particularly the third state in Hamas, right? Because Hamas is acting as a third state, right? The third state in Hamas, the Palestinians as separate from Hamas, because I believe Palestinians are separate from Hamas. They're not one and the same. And then the Israelis, it's going to force there to be a larger conversation on how do we deal with third states that are not state actors in Hamas, and how then the UN is organized and equipped to deal with that, right? So I think it opens up a conversation about these permanent members, a conversation that we have been having in many ways since the fall of Berlin. So since the Soviet Union has been dismantled, there's been a larger conversation around why we need to either rotate these 5 permanent members, or that we need to have a larger overarching conversation about permanent membership. And I think that permanent membership is going to survive, right? But I think that who then becomes permanent members expands, and then getting a consensus, right? Getting a majority vote versus an absolution vote is going to then be the result of this skirmish.
Yeah, now you have me rethinking Niger, on Niger, what's been going on in Ethiopia, what's going on in Somalia.
Again, right. Why Ethiopia? To your point, why Ethiopia and Eritrea? Because that's a long-standing ethnic argument that has happened for decades. And where is the African Union? Where is the headquarters of the African Union? In Addis Ababa.
Yep.
Right. So what? And I know that scholars would come back and yank at my arguments because they're saying they're thinly veiled or they're loosely connected. The argument that I'm making here, and I'm making this for the academics that may watch, or those of you that are of the intelligentsia that may watch. The argument that I'm making here is that every time there is an expansion of Black power, which all of us in academic circles agree there has been. Anytime there's an expansion of Black political power, there is a white backlash hand slap. And what that backhand slap looks like is then stoking ethnic tensions across the world, and stroking ethnic tensions that forces the international stage to then reset itself.
Mm. Thank you, Dr. Nelson, for talking with Ark Republic. Until next time.
Until next time.
Let's embark on the Ark Republic to hear current news that's published. More than gossip and chatter, covering current affairs that matter. We talk issues with professional views, all keeping you in queue. We wanted a higher vibe for these days and times, to free the voices and minds, reporting the sign of the times, so all can build. Let's shine, yeah.